The first thing Rosie asked for was salsa. Not money, not a ride, not even help, just salsa. Jim had no idea why a girl, sitting barefoot outside an abandoned gas station covered in dust and miles of silence, would ask for something so simple. But he did the only thing that made sense. He tore his last taco in half and handed it to her. Neither of them knew it yet. But that small, quiet choice was about to change both of their lives in ways no one could have seen coming. If you find yourself drawn to stories about second chances, about ordinary people holding broken things together with kindness, stubbornness, and a little bit of duct tape, then maybe hit that like button. And if you believe that sometimes staying is the bravest choice of all, go ahead and subscribe. No rush, no pressure, just stay a while. The gas station had no gas, hadn't for years. A rusted sign swung in the wind. Half the letters were gone. The rest faded beyond recognition. A faded red pickup truck rolled to a stop beside the cracked curb, engine coughing like an old man refusing to quit. Jim Carter stepped out, mid-40s, lines around his eyes that didn't come from laughter. He popped the hood and sighed. Same problem, radiator leak again. He grabbed a wrench from the back, wiped his hands on a rag older than his daughter, and muttered under his breath. That's when he heard it. A voice, low, raspy, a strange mix of defiance and hesitation. I ain't begging, but you got any extra salsa? Jim turned his head. She was standing under the broken awning. Young, mid-20s maybe. Dirt smeared across her jeans, sleeves frayed, shoes barely holding together with mismatched laces and duct tape. But it was the boots beside her that caught his eye. A pair of cowboy boots way too big for her feet, scuffed, cracked, and worn thin. Someone else's boots, someone long gone. Her eyes stayed low, not meeting his. She shifted her weight, thumb hooked into the strap of a battered canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. Jim blinked, looked down at the greasy paper bag sitting on his passenger seat. Inside, 2 tacos, lunch he'd grabbed after his last delivery. One for him, one for Ella. His daughter wouldn't be hungry until dinner. He pulled the bag out, walked over without saying much, tore one taco in half, held it out. She hesitated. He didn't push. No salsa, he finally said, but it's got cheese. A beat passed. Then she stepped forward, reached out, and took it, carefully, like someone who hadn't been offered anything in a long time. Jim sat down on the edge of the curb, the concrete still warm from the afternoon sun. After a pause, she sat too, 5 feet apart, not close enough to feel intrusive, not far enough to pretend they weren't sharing something. Wind blew, dust danced across the empty parking lot. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime clattered against an old porch. Neither of them spoke. She ate slowly. Not like someone starving, more like someone savoring, as if rushing would mean losing it too soon. Jim bit into his half, chewed, stared ahead at nothing. Then out of the corner of his eye, noticed the edge of something sticking out from her backpack. A corner of paper, folded, frayed, marked with something red, a map, not a tourist map, older. Hand-drawn lines, faded ink, creases from being folded and unfolded too many times, and there a red circle, not sloppy like someone doodling, precise, deliberate. He didn't ask. She caught him looking but didn't pull it away, just shifted the strap slightly, adjusting the weight. Silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence people carried when words hadn't helped them for a long while. Jim finished his taco, brushed crumbs off his hands. Name's Jim, he offered, casual, not expecting anything back. She didn't answer. That was fine. Some folks don't give their name until they know yours won't hurt them. Jim stood, wiped his hands again, tossed the empty wrapper into the bed of his truck, checked the radiator once more, still leaking, not urgent yet, Before climbing back in, he glanced her way. "You all right out here?" It wasn't pity, just a question. She shrugged. "Been all right so far." He nodded, started the engine. It coughed but turned over. For a second he almost pulled away, almost. Then he reached into the glove box, pulled out a half-full bottle of water, walked back and handed it to her. "For later," he said. This time she met his eyes, only for a second, but long enough. "Thanks," she said, voice quieter now. Jim tipped his hat, climbed in, and drove off. In the rearview mirror, he saw her still sitting there, boots by her side, watching the horizon. Watching nothing. But something about it stuck. He didn't know it yet, but neither of them would forget that taco. The wind shifted, hot, dry, restless. Dust scraped against the metal siding of the gas station like fingernails on old tin. Overhead, the sun lowered toward the ridgeline. Its light turned softer, more forgiving, but the heat lingered. Jim leaned back against the rusted pillar, arms resting on his knees. He chewed slowly. Not because the taco was particularly good, but because there wasn't a reason to hurry. You eat fast when someone's waiting for you. But when the day's winding down and no deadlines loom, food becomes something else. A reason to sit, to stay. The girl, no, not a girl exactly, not a kid, but not yet middle-aged, sat cross-legged on the concrete, one boot tapping absent-mindedly against the ground. She ate even slower than he did, careful bites, chewing until each piece practically dissolved before swallowing. It wasn't desperation, it was ritual, like someone who learned not to trust the next meal would come easy. Neither of them spoke. Above them, a bent metal sign creaked with every gust. It still had the faint outline of gas prices frozen sometime around 1997. A relic nobody bothered to scrape off. Jim wiped his hands on the rag he always kept tucked in his back pocket. His eyes wandered, not out of nosiness, just habit. When you've spent most of your life hauling other people's forgotten junk, you get good at reading the things they leave behind. That's when he saw it again. Her backpack, worn canvas, had flopped open slightly when she sat. Tucked just inside was a piece of paper. No, thicker, parchment maybe. Not white, but yellowed with age. The edge was torn, corners rounded not by scissors, but by time and handling. A map. He could see the lines, hand-drawn, not printed, curves and markers, tiny symbols he didn't recognize. Roads that didn't look like highways, boundary lines without labels. But one thing stood out. Right near the fold, in the upper left quadrant, a red circle. Precise. Clean. Drawn with a steady hand. Jim tried not to stare, turned his gaze back toward the road, but curiosity had its own weight, heavier than pride sometimes. That map didn't belong to a person drifting. It wasn't a tourist map or a scavenger's mark. It was the kind of thing someone kept when they were looking for something, or maybe when they were trying to remember something nobody else wanted to remember. She noticed, didn't pull it away, didn't close the flap. Just reached over, adjusted the strap like it had bothered her shoulder. Her hand hovered for a second, almost as if debating whether to zip it closed, but in the end, she let it be. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, not watching anything in particular. Just the vast stretch of flat, empty land where the road disappeared into nothing. Jim cleared his throat. "You passing through?" She didn't answer right away, picked at the corner of the taco, then finally said, "Depends." "On?" She shrugged. "If the road leads where I think it does." A pause. The wind stirred the dirt again, tiny whirlwinds forming, then unraveling just as fast. Jim nodded slowly. "Well, roads out here don't always go where the map says." At that, a flicker of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, quick but real. She finished the last bite, brushed crumbs from her hands onto the concrete, watching them scatter like seeds on dry ground. Jim stood, stretched his back, wiped his hands again, checked his radiator one more time, still leaking, but manageable. He glanced back at her. She was adjusting her boots, tightening a knot in one of the laces, a lace that wasn't really a lace but a strip of torn denim threaded through eyelets. "You got a name?" he asked. Not pushy, just casual, like asking about the weather. She didn't look up. "People call me lots of things. Any you like?" Her hands paused, fingers stilled on the boot. For a second, Jim thought she wouldn't answer. But then, almost too quiet to hear, she said, "Rosie." Jim tipped his head like that name fit, like it made sense somehow, even though it shouldn't. "All right, Rosie," he said. "You take care." He stepped toward his truck. The engine coughed, then rumbled to life. As he put it in gear, he glanced one more time in the rearview mirror. She was still sitting there. The wind tugged at her jacket, hair whipping across her face. Her backpack sat open beside her, and that map with its red circle caught the last light of the sun just before it dipped below the hills. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Jim found himself wondering. Not where she was going, but what she might be running from. The first drop landed on his windshield like a pebble, then another, then 5 more. Jim glanced upward. No clouds an hour ago. Now the sky above Dust Haven had turned the color of old iron. Thick, heavy. The kind of sky that didn't ask permission before dumping everything it carried. West Texas wasn't famous for rain. Folks here knew drought better than their own birthdays, but every now and then the weather remembered how to surprise them. The rain started in earnest halfway down the highway. Big fat drops that hit the asphalt so hard they bounced. Jim turned his wipers on. They smeared more than they cleared. He hadn't meant to think about her. But as the miles ticked by, he found his mind drifting back to that girl, Rosie. Sitting there under the broken awning like she'd grown out of the concrete, those worn boots beside her. That map folded just enough to tempt curiosity, but not enough to invite questions. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Didn't matter. She was a stranger. Everyone's got their own load to carry. But when he passed the exit for County Road 14, something caught in his chest, a feeling. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet nudge a man gets when he knows something ain't sitting right in his bones. Jim slowed, tapped the brakes, checked the rearview mirror. A long, empty stretch of road behind him. And ahead, nothing but the dark line of mountains and rain swallowing the horizon. His truck idled at the intersection longer than it should have. Then, with a sigh that sounded heavier than the sky, he eased the wheel, turned around, and headed back. 15 minutes later, he pulled into the lot of the old gas station. The place looked worse in the rain. Water poured through gaps in the awning. Puddles formed where the ground had caved. Trash floated in tiny rivers across the cracked concrete. She was still there, curled up against the wall, hood pulled low, backpack hugged to her chest like it was the last thing she owned. Her boots had been shoved under her knees to keep them dry, though nothing about her looked dry anymore. Jim parked, didn't kill the engine, rolled the window down. "You plan on growing roots there?" His voice wasn't sharp, but it wasn't soft either. Rosie didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were clear, not scared, not surprised, just tired. "Didn't think it was raining when I sat down," she said. Jim huffed through his nose. He glanced toward the back of his truck. A battered camper shell covered the bed, not airtight, not fancy, but it was dry. "Well," he muttered, "guess it is now." He stepped out. Rain soaked through his flannel shirt before he even crossed the lot. Popped the camper open, pulled some tarp and an old moving blanket to one side, slapped the side of the truck twice. "Back here's dry enough. Ain't much, but better than pretending that wall's gonna keep you dry." Rosie studied him, measured him with that same look street dogs give before deciding if your hand holds food or something worse. She didn't move. Jim sighed. "Suit yourself." Turned back toward the driver's seat. Got one boot in before her voice floated over the rain. Hey, he glanced back. Is it, is it okay if... She nodded toward the truck bed. Just for the night? Yeah, he said simply. Just for the night. No contract, no handshake. Just the kind of deal two people make when neither has enough left to offer more than a little space and a little mercy. Rosie climbed into the truck bed, tucked her boots in first, then her backpack, then herself, sat cross-legged, pulling the blanket around her shoulders without asking if it was his. Some things didn't need asking. Jim shut the camper door, checked the latch, walked back around, slid into the driver's seat and pulled out slowly, tires splashing through muddy water, taillights cutting a thin red line through the storm. As he drove, the sound of rain on metal filled the silence. It wasn't loud, wasn't gentle either, just steady. Jim glanced back once in the rearview mirror. All he could see was the outline of a girl sitting in the back of his truck. A silhouette against the dim glow of his dashboard lights. Knees hugged to her chest, boots bibbing her. No words passed between them after that. But somehow, that silence felt like the beginning of something. The rain didn't let up. It tapped steady against the aluminum shell of the truck, like fingers drumming on an old coffee can. Inside the truck bed it was dry. Not warm, not exactly comfortable, but dry. Sometimes that's all a person really needs. Rosie sat with her back pressed against the cab wall. Legs crossed, boots tucked close like they might try to wander off in the night if she didn't hold them near. The moving blanket Jim had tossed in smelled like old pine, dust and something faintly sweet, maybe motor oil, maybe coffee. Something lived in, something human. She adjusted the corner of the tarp above her head, watched how the water beaded and rolled down the plastic. Outside the window, nothing but black, the kind of dark that only exists miles from streetlights, deep in the spaces most people pass through but never stop. Then through the wall behind her she heard it, a cough, soft, tight, followed by a wheeze. Then silence. Rosie shifted, leaned forward, peered through the small cab window separating the bed from the truck's front seat. Inside, the dashboard lights glowed a gentle amber. The windshield wipers squeaked every few seconds, keeping a steady rhythm. And there, curled up on the passenger seat, was a kid. A girl, tiny, no more than 8 or 9, messy hair in 2 braids that had half unraveled. One small hand clutched a well-worn inhaler, the other hugged a faded stuffed rabbit with one ear nearly torn off. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, each one dragging through the whistle of lungs fighting the damp air. Rosie blinked. She hadn't expected this. Jim sat in the driver's seat, chin tilted down, arms crossed, head resting against the side window. Not fully asleep. The kind of half-sleep people learn when they've spent too long looking after someone who can't always breathe right. The girl stirred, mumbled something in her sleep, hugged the rabbit tighter. A laugh, small, involuntary, slipped from Rosie's throat before she could catch it. It wasn't mocking, not even amused, just soft, honest, the kind of laugh that bubbles up when something cracks the hard shell life forces around you. A kid, this grumpy, grease-stained man, had a kid. Rosie leaned her head against the cool metal of the cab. Let the rhythm of rain fill the silence again. She didn't know why that made something inside her soften. Maybe it was the way the kid's nose scrunched when she shifted, or how Jim, even asleep, seemed wired to her every breath, shoulders tensing slightly with each cough, even without waking. Nobody told her there was a kid involved, not that it was her business, but it changed something. She glanced down at her own hands, traced the torn edge of her bootlace, wondered, not for the first time, how a life could wander so far off track that a dry truck bed in a stranger's vehicle felt like safety. Another wheeze from the front, then the kid settled. Breathing smoothed just a little. Rosie pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The smell of pine and dust suddenly felt less foreign, less like someone else's life, and more like a space she was allowed to borrow. For tonight, at least. Her eyes drifted toward the backpack at her side. The map inside still waited, still whispered the same questions it had since the day she first unfolded it. But for the first time in a long while, those questions felt quieter, not gone, but waiting, just like everything else. She yawned, pressed her knees closer to her chest, let the sound of the rain and the quiet, uneven breaths of the child on the other side of the wall lull her somewhere between awake and asleep. Before her eyes closed completely, she caught one last glimpse through the window. Jim shifted. Without opening his eyes, his hand reached out, found the girl's shoulder, rested there firm but gentle, just making sure. Rosie smiled, not wide, not bright, just enough to remind her face it still knew how. And with that, for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she let herself drift. By morning, the rain had passed. The air smelled like wet dirt and old asphalt. Puddles reflected a sky washed clean blue as enamel. Dust Haven always looked a little better after a storm. Not good exactly, but softer around the edges. Jim turned the key, coaxed the old pickup into a reluctant rumble, and headed toward Main Street. Rosie was already in the passenger seat when he came out of the house. Boots laced, backpack hugged close, face unreadable. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't offer. 10 minutes later, they pulled up in front of Deeks' Pawn and Loan. It was a squat, cinder block building with a sorghum-faded sign that hadn't seen fresh paint in at least 2 decades. Bars on the windows, neon open sign flickering like it wasn't sure it believed itself. Jim killed the engine, exhaled like it was a habit more than a need. "Stay or come in," he said. "Your call." Rosie considered it, thumbed the strap of her backpack, then without a word slid out of the truck and followed. A little bell jangled as they stepped inside. The smell hit first, a mixture of metal, dust, and something sour, maybe regret. Shelves sagged under the weight of things people once loved and later needed to let go. Guitars with cracked necks. Power tools missing cords. Wedding rings in dusty glass cases, sitting under fluorescent lights that made the gold look colder than it should. Deke stood behind the counter, late 60s, heavy set. A mustache yellowed at the edges from decades of cigarettes. He wore the same brown apron he'd probably worn since the 80s, stitched above the pocket, barely legible. Deeks, proprietor. "Morning," Jim said, tipping his chin. Deeks didn't look up right away. He was fiddling with a broken radio, screwdriver in hand. When he did glance up, his eyes skipped right over Jim, then snagged on Rosie, and something changed. Not his posture, that stayed slouched. Not his hands. They kept turning the screwdriver. But his face, something there stiffened. Like a man who'd just recognized a song he hadn't heard in years, one that brought back more than he wanted. "Well, I'll be damned," Deeks muttered. Jim noticed, filed it away, didn't say anything yet. "Got anything for me?" Deeks asked, his voice more clipped now. Jim reached into his jacket, pulled out a pair of antique wrenches wrapped in an oily rag. "Picked these up off a job last month. Craftsman 1950s, good condition." Deeks barely glanced at them. 15, Jim grunted. "They're worth 30. 15, Deeks repeated, setting the screwdriver down. His eyes flicked to Rosie again. Not hostile, but not exactly friendly either. Rosie shifted, didn't step back, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her pack. 20, Jim countered. Deke sighed. Fine. 20. He opened the register, counted out a pair of worn bills, slid them across the counter, took the wrenches like he was more interested in getting this done than haggling. Jim tucked the money into his pocket, didn't thank him. The silence after stretched longer than it needed to. Then, casual but not really, Deke said, "She yours?" Jim followed his gaze to Rosie. Didn't answer right away. "Does it matter?" His tone was even. Deke scratched his mustache. "Suppose not." Then softer, almost to himself. "Ain't seen her kind round here in a long while." Rosie's eyes didn't flinch. Her shoulders squared, but the fingers on her backpack stayed white-knuckled. Jim stepped forward, not aggressive, just closer. "You gonna say what you mean?" he said, quiet but steady. "Or you gonna keep playing at it?" Deke stared at him for a beat longer, then looked down, fiddled with the register like it suddenly needed fixing. "Nah," he mumbled. "Ain't my business." Jim didn't push, just tipped his head once. "Appreciate the 20, he said, voice neutral. "Have a good one." He turned. Rosie followed without being told. As they stepped back into the sunlight, the little bell jangled behind them. Neither of them spoke until they were halfway to the truck. Then Rosie murmured, almost like it surprised her to hear herself say it. "He knew." Jim nodded, unlocking the door. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, he did." The ride back was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from awkwardness. Not even the kind that means someone's holding back anger. No. This was a quieter quiet. The kind that sits between two people who both know better than to ask a question before the other's ready to answer. Jim kept his hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward. But every so often, he flicked a glance toward the passenger seat. Rosie sat stiff, shoulders drawn in, elbows tucked tight as if she were trying to take up less space than she did. Her boots, scuffed, cracked, dust-caked, tapped softly against the truck floor in a slow, restless rhythm. Jim thought about what Deeks had said, or, more accurately, what Deeks hadn't said, the way the old man's eyes shifted, the way his hands shook just a little when he realized who was standing in front of him. Didn't take a genius to figure there was history here. Old history. Heavy. The truck rumbled down the county road, tires crunching over gravel. Just past the bend where the cottonwoods gave way to open scrub, Jim pulled over. Cut the engine but left the keys dangling. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rosie sighed, pulled her backpack into her lap, opened it. Not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Like someone unpacking something that wasn't just a thing, but a piece of their ribs. From the front pocket, she slid out an envelope, edges yellowed. The kind of paper that frays not because it's weak, but because it's been folded and unfolded so many times it just gave up trying to hold together. She pulled out a photo, held it there in her palm, stared at it. Thumb brushed over one corner slow, like wiping away dust that wasn't really there. Then, without looking at Jim, she passed it over. "Here," she said softly. "You might as well see it." Jim took it, turned it over in his hands. The picture was old, faded. The colors had bled together over time. Blues turned to gray, whites to yellow. But the image was still clear enough. A gate, wooden, tall, hand-carved letters across the top beam. Harrison Ranch. Beyond it, a long dirt driveway flanked by fence posts and barbed wire. An oak tree bent sideways by the wind standing sentinel near the entrance. In the far background, just barely visible, a farmhouse. 2 stories. Wrap-around porch sagging slightly at one end, roof patched with tin sheets. But it wasn't the gate, or the house, or the landscape that made Jim's stomach tighten. It was the girl standing under the gate, 7, maybe 8 years old, hair pulled into messy pigtails, wearing a flannel shirt 3 sizes too big and a pair of cowboy boots that swallowed her ankles whole. Smiling, not the kind of smile you give for school photos or for parents who tell you to say cheese. This was different. It was the smile of someone who belonged. Jim let out a slow breath. "That's you," he said, not as a question. Rosie nodded. "Yeah, a long time ago." He studied the photo again. "Where is this place?" Her fingers tensed slightly on the edge of her backpack. "About 15 miles north of here, way out past the hills, back when there were more fences than roads." Jim tapped the edge of the picture. "Harrison Ranch. Your family's?" A pause, then quieter. "Was?" Jim nodded, slow. "And now?" Rosie leaned her head back against the window. Let her eyes drift toward the ceiling like maybe the words were written up there, waiting. "Now, I don't know what it is, or who it belongs to, haven't been back since—" Her voice caught for just a second. "Since everything changed." Jim handed the photo back. She didn't take it right away, just stared at it in his hand like it was something dangerous, or sacred, or both. Then she reached, folded it back into the envelope, slid it into the backpack, pulled the zipper closed with the kind of care most folks reserve for fragile things. Silence again, but this one felt heavier. Jim adjusted his grip on the wheel, cleared his throat. "You think, maybe you should go back, see it." Rosie didn't answer right away, chewed on the inside of her cheek. Fingers fidgeted with the frayed seam of her jacket. "I've thought about it," she said finally, "more times than I can count. And, every time, I remember why I left." Jim nodded. Let that sit. Then he started the engine, let the truck rumble back to life. "Thing about roads," he said quietly as he pulled back onto the gravel. "They run 2 ways, out and back." Rosie didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. Out the window, the sun was dipping lower. Long shadows stretched across the hill. And somewhere, not far but far enough to feel like another lifetime, a gate stood. Maybe broken, maybe rotted, maybe waiting. Jim didn't know. Rosie wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long while, the question felt possible. The land office sat at the far end of Main Street. A squat brick building with a crooked flagpole out front and windows smudged with years of desert wind and fingerprints nobody cared enough to wipe. Jim pulled the truck into a diagonal spot, killed the engine. Let the tick of the cooling radiator fill the silence for a few moments. Beside him, Rosie sat stiff. Not tense like someone ready to bolt, tense like someone sitting in the waiting room of a dentist they'd avoided for 10 years. Knowing the pain's coming, but knowing they can't ignore it anymore. "You sure about this?" Jim asked, adjusting his cap. Rosie didn't answer right away, just stared at the faded government seal stenciled on the glass door. "I'm not sure about anything," she finally said, "but I'm here." "That counts," Jim replied, pushing open his door. The office smelled like every small-town government building. Stale coffee, old paper, and air conditioning that hadn't worked right since the Reagan administration. A wooden counter stretched across the room. Behind it, shelves sagged under the weight of file boxes, maps rolled up with masking tape, and clipboards hanging like forgotten promises. A man stood behind the counter, mid-60s, pinstriped shirt under a brown vest, wireframe glasses sliding down his nose. His hair was thin but combed with the kind of precision that suggested he still believed in the importance of being presentable, even if the world didn't notice anymore. A brass nameplate sat on the counter. L. Farnsworth, County Records. He glanced up as the bell above the door chimed. Jim stepped forward, tipped his chin politely. "Morning." Farnsworth returned the nod. "Morning." "What can I help?" His voice stopped mid-sentence. His gaze shifted past Jim, landed on Rosie, and his entire posture shifted, not dramatically, not like a man startled by a ghost, but like someone recognizing a face they never expected to see again. His hands froze mid-reach for a clipboard, his mouth pressed into a tight line. "Well now," he said, voice lower, measured. "Didn't think I'd—" His words faded, unfinished. Rosie didn't flinch, but Jim could see it, the smallest tightening of her jaw, her thumb hooking into the frayed strap of her backpack like it was the only thing keeping her tethered. "Mr. Farnsworth," Rosie said, steady but quiet. "It's been a while." Farnsworth blinked, adjusted his glasses, then, with a sigh that sounded more tired than anything else, set the clipboard aside. "Miss Harrison," he said, "that's a name I haven't heard spoken in this office in years." Jim stiffened slightly, glanced at Rosie. Harrison. The name from the photo, the gate, the land. Rosie didn't react, didn't confirm, didn't deny, just stood there, letting the name settle in the air like dust in sunlight. Farnsworth stepped out from behind the counter, walked slowly to a filing cabinet against the far wall, pulled it open. Fingers moved with the ease of someone who knew every drawer by heart. "I figured," he started, "when your mother passed, and you, well," his voice trailed off. "We didn't think you'd ever come back." Rosie's hands balled into fists at her sides. "I didn't plan to." Farnsworth pulled a folder free. Thick, yellowed, stuffed with maps, deeds, letters. "Well," he said softly, flipping it open, "the land didn't forget you." He laid the folder flat on the counter, spread out a survey map, hand-drawn borders, faded ink lines, sections labeled with parcel numbers and owners long dead. But one section, a wide, sprawling rectangle stretching across the foothills and down toward the creek beds, was circled. "Harrison Ranch," Farnsworth said quietly. "Legally still in your name." Jim blinked. "You're telling me—" Farnsworth nodded. "When Margaret Harrison passed, the title transferred directly. No liens, no holds. It's been sitting here, waiting." Rosie swallowed hard. "Waiting for what?" Farnsworth looked at her, not unkindly. "Waiting for you, Miss Harrison. Or for someone else to claim it if you didn't." Jim frowned. "Claim it?" Farnsworth sighed. "Land that sits unoccupied for too long. The county can move to reclaim. Developers circle like buzzards. If there's no owner on record taking responsibility, well, it goes up for public sale." Rosie stiffened. "How long?" Farnsworth tapped the file. 30 days, maybe less. After that, it's open season." Silence. Thick. Heavy. The kind that fills your lungs until it's hard to breathe. Jim glanced at Rosie. Her hands trembled, but her voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. "Show me the rest," she said. Farnsworth's fingers moved carefully across the map. Each line he traced wasn't just ink on paper. It was history. Borders drawn by hands long buried, stakes hammered into the earth before Rosie was even born. "This," he said, tapping the biggest section outlined in red, "is the original Harrison property. 4,812 acres stretching from the western ridgeline all the way down to the Oak Creek Basin." Jim let out a low whistle. That's not a backyard." Farnsworth didn't smile. "No, sir, it is not." Rosie said nothing. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, jaw set. But her eyes Her eyes locked on that map like it was a wound that hadn't healed right. Familiar, painful, unavoidable. Farnsworth flipped the page, pulled out a worn legal document, edges browned, signatures faded, but still legible. Your mother, he said softly, was very precise. Margaret Harrison made sure everything was airtight before she passed. Full inheritance, sole ownership, no shared title, no trusts, and no liens, no encumbrances. He tapped her name near the bottom of the page. Rosalind May Harrison. The name hit the air like a dropped stone. Jim turned his head almost reflexively, as if hearing it made something shift in the room. He looked at Rosie, really looked, like seeing someone not for who they are now, but for every version of them you hadn't known existed until this second. She didn't flinch, didn't move, just stared. I didn't know she... Rosie's voice caught. I didn't think... She never changed it, Farnsworth interrupted gently. Never updated the will, never amended the deed, even after... He hesitated. Even after you left. Silence. Rosie's eyes dropped to the map, traced the boundaries with her gaze, out past the ridge, across the grazing fields, down to the old irrigation ditch where cotton used to grow before the water dried up. Jim cleared his throat. That's a hell of a lot of dirt. Farnsworth nodded. Dirt with water rights, mineral rights, timber rights, all intact. Jim blinked. Wait, mineral rights? Farnsworth sighed. Yeah, this isn't just pasture land underneath that ridge. He pulled out another document, a geological survey, yellowed but intact. There's shale, lots of it. Folks have sniffed around for years, natural gas, oil maybe. It's why the developers won't let this go quiet. Rosie pressed her palms flat against the counter. I thought when I left someone would... Her voice broke a little. I figured it'd be gone. Farnsworth shook his head. Your mother, she fought hard, kept the taxes paid. Even when it got tight, she kept it waiting for you. Jim leaned back against the wall, crossed his arms. So you're telling me, for however long it's been, this land's just been sitting there, nobody working it, nobody living on it, but still hers, Farnsworth nodded. And now, legally, it's hers. He glanced at Rosie. Yours. She closed her eyes, breathed in sharp, exhaled slower. Jim watched her, watched the way her shoulders rose and fell, the way her hands trembled, then stilled, then trembled again. What happens, Rosie asked quietly, if I don't want it? Farnsworth folded his hands, rested them on the counter like a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to. If you walk away, the county starts the process, foreclosure, auction, developers come in, they carve it up, sell it to whoever has the deepest pockets. Jim didn't need to ask who those pockets belonged to. Folks like Cortez Energy, folks who saw land not as roots but as numbers on a spreadsheet. And if I... Rosie hesitated. If I do claim it? Farnsworth's gaze softened. Then it's yours, simple as that. You sign here. He tapped the bottom of the deed. And the Harrison Ranch isn't a memory, it's a fact. The weight of it sat heavy in the room, bigger than paper, bigger than ink, 4,800 acres of weight. Rosie's eyes drifted back to the map, the oak tree by the gate, the winding dirt road, the broken fences, the place where her mother's voice still echoed. Somewhere. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered. Farnsworth gave a slow nod. Land don't care if you're ready, Miss Harrison. It just waits. Farnsworth flipped another page in the file. This one wasn't faded like the others. The paper was crisp, fresh. The ink still sharp, not yet dulled by time. At the top, bold black letters. Notice of pending public auction. Jim leaned in, his eyes narrowed, Rosie stiffened. Farnsworth tapped the document. This is the problem. Jim crossed his arms. How bad? Farnsworth sighed, ran a hand over his thinning hair. Bad enough. He pointed to the fine print. The county's been patient, too patient, frankly. Property taxes went unpaid for 2 years after your mother passed. Normally, the land would have hit auction already, but... He glanced at Rosie. Because of the size, the history, and frankly, because nobody wanted to be the one to push it. It sat longer than it should have. Rosie swallowed. And now? Farnsworth laced his fingers, rested them on the counter. Now, they've run out of patience. He slid the paper closer. In 30 days, the county lists the Harrison property for public auction. Every acre, every water right, every mineral claim. Developers are circling. Hell, they've been circling since before your mother passed. Jim muttered under his breath. Vultures. Farnsworth didn't disagree. Yeah, pretty much. Rosie stared at the document. Her eyes scanned the lines, but it wasn't clear if she was reading it, or just trying to make it real. Jim broke the silence. There's gotta be a way to stop it. Farnsworth nodded. There is, but it's simple. Not easy. He pulled out another form, tapped it twice with his knuckle. You sign this. Today, you formally claim ownership. The back taxes are yours. But once they're paid, the auction halts. Permanently. Rosie blinked. How much? Farnsworth flipped to the tax ledger, ran his finger down a column. $43,764. The number hung in the air like a punch. Jim let out a low whistle. That's a lot, Rosie finished for him. Her voice was flat, hollow. Farnsworth didn't sugarcoat it. It's the land size, plus penalties, interest, fees. Jim shook his head. 43 grand, they sure know how to make it impossible. Farnsworth leaned back in his chair. They don't care who owns it. Not really. They care that someone does. Someone to pay taxes, keep the land out of legal limbo. Developers, they're happy to take it. They're already in talks. Rosie's hands trembled slightly. She gripped the counter to steady them. So if I don't... Farnsworth nodded grimly. The county carves it up. Auctions it in parcels. Pieces go to whoever bids highest. Could be ranchers, could be drillers, could be people who've never stepped foot on that soil but see dollar signs under every rock. Silence pressed down like a physical thing. Rosie stared at the map again, at the red lines that didn't just mark property, but marked memory, childhood, grief, a name she'd tried so hard to outrun and now couldn't. Jim finally spoke, his voice softer. And if she signs, then what? Farnsworth exhaled. Then it's hers, fully. But those taxes, they don't vanish. He looked at Rosie, his eyes softer now, less like a bureaucrat, more like someone who'd watched this same story play out too many times. I won't lie to you, he said. It's heavy, bigger than most can carry alone, but it's yours, if you want it. Rosie didn't answer. Her thumb ran over the seam of her backpack, a nervous habit, or maybe just muscle memory from a lifetime of waiting, but never staying. Then, almost whispering, like the words tasted strange in her mouth, she asked, If I sign, how long do I have to fix it? Farnsworth met her gaze, steady. 30 days to pay the back taxes, 30 days to stop the auction. And after that? He gave the smallest nod. After that, the land's yours. No clock, no deadlines, just yours. The room fell silent again. Except this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was ticking. The road out to the Harrison Ranch wasn't much of a road anymore. What used to be gravel had surrendered to time. Patches of dirt split by weeds. Wheel ruts so deep they could swallow a small car whole. The hills rose around them, dry and golden, breathing in the afternoon heat. Fence posts lined the path, or what was left of them. Half had rotted out, leaning like old men too tired to stand straight. The wire sagged, snapped in places, curling toward the ground like forgotten threads. Jim downshifted as the truck climbed the ridge. The engine grumbled, tires slipping slightly on the loose dirt. Rosie sat quiet in the passenger seat, fingers curled around the frayed strap of her backpack. She hadn't said much since they left the land office, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Ahead, a familiar shape began to form, a silhouette against the sky. The gate, or what was left of it. The wood had splintered along the top beam. The right post leaned hard, as if some storm years back had shoved it sideways and nobody bothered, or maybe nobody dared, to set it right again. The iron hinges dangled useless, and there, barely hanging from a single rusted bolt, the sign, Harrison Ranch. Most of the letters were still there, faded, cracked. The R hung by a thread, swinging with every breath of wind, like it couldn't decide whether to hold on or let go. Rosie stared, didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Jim slowed the truck, brought it to a stop just shy of the gate, killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavier than the wind. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Rosie pushed the door open, stepped out, boots hit dry dirt with a hollow crunch. She walked slowly, not like someone afraid, but like someone stepping onto a grave they hadn't visited in years. Her hand brushed the leaning post. Fingers ran over the splintered wood, over the carved initials still faintly visible beneath the peeling paint. M.H. R.H. Her mother's hands, her own once, small, clumsy somti, helping hammer the nails when she was 8 years old. She remembered, not clearly, but enough. A gust of wind caught the sign. The rusty bolt gave way. The R snapped free, fell. It hit the dirt with a sound too soft to matter, and yet too loud to ignore. Rosie flinched, bent down, picked it up, turned it over in her hands. The back was scorched, charred in one corner. She didn't remember how that happened. Maybe a brush fire, maybe lightning, or maybe just time doing what time always does. Behind her, Jim stepped out of the truck. He didn't say anything, just stood, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the land. Place looks... He didn't finish, didn't need to. The house stood a few 100 yards back, barely. The porch sagged. The roof was bowed in the center like a tired spine. Windows broken or missing. Paint peeled until the wood underneath looked like skin stripped raw. A barn stood further out, doors hanging off, roof patched with a blue tarp long since surrendered to the sun. Fences that once held cattle or horses now held nothing but air. And yet, something about it still breathed, quiet, faint, like an ember buried under ash. Rosie walked through the broken gate, didn't wait for Jim. Boots kicked up clouds of dust as she crossed the yard. Her gaze scanned every corner, every crack, every shadow. This used to be... Her voice broke. She cleared her throat. Used to be green. Jim followed, stopped beside a fence post half buried in weeds, ran his fingers along the split grain. Looks like it's still standing, he said quietly. Barely. Yeah, Jim nodded. But barely ain't the same as gone. Rosie looked back at the house, at the porch where her mother once sat drinking coffee, at the oak tree that still stood crooked beside the barn. And for the first time since she'd left, her hands didn't shake. The gate was broken, the fences were falling, but the land was still here, waiting. The front steps groaned under Rosie's boots, wood splintered where her weight pressed. She paused, tested the next step with the toe of her boot. It held, barely. Jim followed behind, quiet, careful. His eyes scanned the porch. Boards warped by rain, a rocking chair tipped on its side, and an old coffee can full of cigarette butts, half rusted through. The front door stood ajar, hanging crooked on one hinge. Someone had forced it open years ago, or maybe time had done the job itself. Rosie reached out. Fingers hovered over the faded brass handle, then pushed. The door creaked wider. Inside, dust floated in shafts of late-afternoon sunlight, particles dancing, caught mid-air like memories that refused to settle. The air smelled of old wood, dry rot, and something else, something faint, vanilla. Her mother's candle, the one she used to burn in the kitchen window. Rosie swallowed hard. The house hadn't been ransacked. Not exactly. Just abandoned. Shelves still held cracked jars. An old jacket hung on a nail by the door, moth-eaten but familiar. The table sat in the center of the kitchen, tilted where one leg had given out. Rosie stepped inside like someone crossing into a dream they weren't sure belonged to them anymore. Her boots echoed against the wood floor. Jim stayed back, letting her move first, letting her decide what this place was now. Ruin, relic, or something in between. Rosie's fingers drifted along the counter, over the stove, past the chipped ceramic mug still sitting beside the sink. The window above it was cracked, letting in a breeze that made the curtains flutter like ghosts stretching in their sleep. She moved toward the hallway, past the pantry, past the door that once led to the cellar, now swollen shut from moisture. Her steps slowed near the bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was half open, a shadow stretched long across the floor. Rosie pushed it wider. Inside, dust but order. A quilt still covered the bed, though mice had chewed at one corner. The dresser stood where it always had. On top of it, a wooden box. Not locked, not hidden, just waiting. Rosie walked over, hands trembling now, though she told herself they weren't. She brushed a layer of dust off the lid. Carved into the top, by hand, were 3 words, simple, uneven, for my Rosie. Her throat tightened, breath hitched. Jim stood quietly in the doorway, hat in hand. He said nothing, just waited. Rosie flipped the latch. Inside, not much. A folded piece of paper, brittle and yellowed. A photo. Her, maybe 6 years old, sitting on the front steps with a stick of sidewalk chalk, grinning wide, her mother's arm slung casually over her shoulder. And a cassette tape, black plastic. Label faded, but the words were still there, written in her mother's unmistakable cursive. Loi nan kwami. Rosie stared at it like it might burn her fingers. A cassette. Who even had a player anymore? Jim cleared his throat. Truck's got one, he said quietly. Rosie blinked, looked at him. Old stereo? Jim shrugged. Hasn't worked for radio in years, but the tape deck still spins. Rosie swallowed, thumbed the edge of the cassette, ran her fingers over the label. Her mother's handwriting. It hit her harder than the house, harder than the broken fence, harder than the map, the deed, the auction notice, or any of it. This was her voice, waiting. Rosie gathered the tape, folded the photo gently, slipped the paper into her jacket pocket, closed the box with trembling hands. For a long moment she just stood there, eyes closed, breathing. Then, quietly but steady, she turned back toward Jim. Let's go, she said. Jim nodded. No questions, no pressure, just, all right. They stepped back out into the hallway, back through the kitchen, past the curtains still fluttering in the cracked window. Down the steps that creaked but held, across the yard where the dust caught the sunlight like gold scattered thin. Back toward the truck. Back toward the waiting cassette player, and whatever words time had kept locked inside. The sun sank fast out here. 1 minute it hovered, bleeding orange and gold across the hills. The next, it was gone, swallowed behind the ridgeline, leaving only the kind of deep, heavy blue that pressed close against the skin. The old porch creaked beneath Rosie's boots as she sat down on the top step, elbows on her knees, shoulders drawn in tight. The cassette sat in her hands, black plastic, faded label. Her mother's handwriting staring back at her like a pair of eyes she hadn't seen in too long. Jim was somewhere inside the truck, tinkering with something. Giving her space, he understood without asking that there were things you had to face alone. The wind had changed. Cooler now, carried the dry smell of mesquite, dust, and something older. The scent of wood left out in the sun too long. The kind of smell that didn't belong to any one person, but to the land itself. Rosie turned the cassette over in her hands. Again and again. Her thumb traced the edge of the tape window, the tiny reels inside, waiting, waiting. Just like the land, just like the house, just like the name she'd carried and dropped, and somehow still found again. She didn't know what was on it. Words of comfort, a goodbye, instructions, forgiveness, or worse, disappointment sealed in magnetic tape. Part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know, because once you heard a thing, you couldn't unhear it, couldn't stuff it back into a box and pretend it never existed. She squeezed her eyes shut, let her forehead rest against her knuckles. "You should listen," she whispered into the dark. "You came all this way. You should." But her hands didn't move. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, not close, not far, just out there. A reminder that wild things still lived in places like this, even when people forgot how. The porch board shifted. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Jim. He didn't sit beside her, didn't crowd her, just stood at the bottom of the steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the darkening horizon. "Stars are coming out," he said after a while, his voice low, like he was talking to the wind as much as to her. "Out here you can see every one of them, like somebody spilled a jar of sugar across the sky." Rosie didn't answer. Didn't have to. Jim kicked a pebble with the toe of his boot, let it skitter across the dirt. "You don't have to listen tonight," he said. "Or tomorrow. Hell, maybe not ever. Ain't no rule says you gotta open every box life hands you." Rosie's grip tightened around the cassette. "But," Jim added, softer now, sometimes not opening it's heavier than knowing." The wind shifted again, brought with it the faintest smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. A promise, or a threat, hard to tell. Rosie raised her head, looked down at the tape in her hands. Her mother's handwriting, familiar, terrifying. "I don't know what she's gonna say," Rosie admitted. Her voice cracked a little. "I don't know if I want to hear it." Jim nodded. "Yeah, I get that." Silence stretched. Then Rosie whispered, barely loud enough for even herself to hear, "I don't know if I deserve to." Jim didn't answer right away, let the words settle, let them breathe. Then, steady, quiet, certain, he said, "Doesn't matter if you think you do, she thought you did, or else that tape wouldn't be sitting in your hands right now." Rosie blinked hard, swallowed. She turned the cassette over one more time, looked at it like it held the answer to every question she'd tried not to ask for years. But her hands still wouldn't move, not yet. So she sat there, under a sky filling with stars, holding a voice from the past and letting the future. Wait, the place didn't even have a sign, just a faded window with the words electronics, repair, radio barely visible under years of sun fade and dust. A hand-painted open hung crooked behind cracked glass, though Jim wasn't entirely sure whether it was meant as an invitation or a dare. He pulled the truck to the curb, killed the engine, looked over at Rosie. "You sure about this?" he asked. She glanced down at the cassette in her hands. ran her thumb along the edge of the plastic. "Not really," she said. "But, yeah." Jim nodded. "All right, then." The bell over the door didn't jingle when they pushed it open. It clanked, like someone had hung an old wrench from a piece of wire and called it good. Inside, chaos. Stacks of VCRs, towers of broken boom boxes, shelves lined with radios, TV remotes, walkie-talkies, tangled cords like nests abandoned by electronic birds. Somewhere in the back, something hummed, maybe a soldering iron. Or maybe just the building's nervous system trying to hold itself together. Behind the counter sat Travis. Or rather, Travis leaned. A man in his 70s, long white hair pulled into a low ponytail, thick glasses that made his eyes look twice their normal size. A cigarette, unlit, dangled from the corner of his mouth, chewed down flat. His stained flannel shirt had at least 6 visible burn holes from solder splashes, and probably a few more hidden under the grease-streaked apron. He didn't look up right away, just kept fiddling with the guts of a tape deck, screwdriver in one hand, magnifying lamp pulled low over his face. "Be with ya," he grunted. "Unless the building's on fire." Jim leaned on the counter. "No flames yet." At the sound of his voice, Travis paused, lifted the magnifier, squinted. "Well, hell," he said. "If it ain't Carter." Jim grinned. "Still breathing, Travis?" "Yeah, much to the disappointment of my ex-wives." Travis set the screwdriver down, pulled the glasses up onto his forehead. Only then did his eyes drift toward Rosie, standing just behind Jim, clutching the cassette like it might shatter. Travis nodded, polite but neutral. "Friend of yours?" Jim glanced back. "Yeah, she's got something that might be delicate." "Delicate?" Travis snorted. "Around here that usually means either antique or sentimental. Or both." Jim tapped the counter. "Both." Travis wiped his hands on a rag that looked older than most of the equipment in the shop. "All right, let's see it." Rosie stepped forward, quiet, careful. She placed the cassette on the counter, not like dropping an object, but like setting something down at an altar. Travis stared at it, raised one bushy eyebrow. "Haven't seen one of these in a while." He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, read the label. Not out loud, but Rosie knew he'd read it. "Loi nan komi." His expression shifted, just slightly. Not pity, not curiosity, just softer. The kind of understanding that comes from a life long enough to have lost a few things that couldn't be repaired. "Let me guess," he said, turning the tape over. "You ain't got anything that plays this?" Rosie nodded. "Not anymore." Travis chuckled. "Yeah, nobody does." He walked over to the back wall, shifted a stack of broken car stereos, pulled out an old Panasonic dual-deck boombox, the kind with chunky buttons and faded stickers from some forgotten decade. "Still works," he said, patting it like an old dog. "Most days, anyway." He plugged it in. Hit play. Nothing. The motor spun, but no sound. "Figures." He popped the top open, checked the belts, frowned. "Yeah, rubber's shot. Happens." Jim crossed his arms. "Can you fix it?" Travis looked up over his glasses. "Jim, this shop's where dead things come to remember how to breathe." He set the boombox on the counter, rolled his stool over, pulled the magnifier back down, hands steady, movements sure. As he worked, Rosie hovered nearby, watching, fingers drumming against her thigh. Breath shallow. Travis didn't rush, didn't speak, just worked. Replaced belts, cleaned heads, tightened connections, swapped a capacitor from some long-dead stereo, muttered under his breath but not words anyone needed to hear, finally. He sat back, hit play again, the reels turned, the heads engaged, a faint hiss, then Silence, not broken, not failure, just waiting. Travis didn't look up, just tapped the volume knob. "Moment of truth," he said, and pressed rewind. The boombox clicked softly as the tape reached the beginning. Travis glanced up over his glasses, one hand hovering near the volume knob as though giving Rosie one last chance to say no. She didn't. Couldn't. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter so tight her knuckles went pale. Travis pressed play. For a moment, only the familiar sound of tape hiss filled the room. That soft, steady, white noise anyone who'd ever owned a cassette knew by heart. Then, a tiny pop, a shuffle, and a breath. Then a voice. "Hey, baby." Soft, warm, the kind of voice that fills a kitchen on quiet mornings. The kind that hums while folding laundry or stirring soup. A voice woven into childhood, even if time had tried to fray it. Rosie's eyes slammed shut. Her shoulders trembled. Jim didn't move, didn't speak, just stood, hat in hand, letting the air do the holding. "I don't know if you'll ever find this," the voice continued. "Maybe you never come back. Maybe that's all right. Maybe that's what you needed." A pause, the sound of a chair scraping, a soft sigh. "But just in case you do, I needed to say this." Travis shifted quietly on his stool but kept his eyes down. His hands folded in his lap. Even for a man surrounded by broken things, this moment wasn't one to fix. It was one to witness. The voice grew softer but steady. "I was never good with saying the right things when it mattered. You know that. I was stubborn. Well, you got that from me." A chuckle, faint, cracked around the edges. "I don't blame you for leaving. Never did. I know it felt like I expected you to carry the whole world on your back, and maybe I did. Maybe that wasn't fair." Rosie's hands trembled. Her thumb pressed into the wood of the counter, grounding herself against something real. Because the voice was too much like a ghost made solid, the tape hissed. Then the voice came back, quieter. "This land, this place, it never needed to own you. It was never about fences or deeds or borders drawn on a map." A breath, audible, as though her mother had leaned forward, elbows on the same kitchen table that now sat gathering dust miles away. "It was about roots, about knowing where yours are, even if you grow somewhere else." The voice trembled just once. "I loved you, more than I knew how to say. And I was proud even when I was too damn stubborn to tell you." Silence, a sniff, a shaky breath. "If you're hearing this, then maybe you're ready to come home, or maybe not. Either way, you should know you were never lost to me." Another pause, longer this time. The tape hissed, crackled, then softer than anything that came before. "The land waits, and so do I." A click, silence. The tape spun, but there was nothing left to say. No music, no goodbye, just air. Rosie stood frozen, her hands trembling. Her eyes glassed over but dry, not because there were no tears, but because her body hadn't decided whether to cry or to breathe. Jim swallowed, his throat tighter than he expected. Travis reached forward, pressed stop. The reels slowed, clicked, stilled. The room was utterly silent. Rosie's fingers released the counter. Her hands dropped to her sides. Her knees felt loose, unsteady, but she stood there, like the last fence post still upright in a row of broken ones. Jim finally cleared his throat. Quiet, careful. "You okay?" he asked. Rosie blinked, opened her mouth, closed it. Then, after a long, long breath, she nodded. "No," she whispered, "but maybe getting there." Travis said nothing, just slid the tape back toward her gently like it was something sacred. Rosie picked it up, held it close, not to her chest, not yet, but close enough. Jim pulled his hat back on, gave Travis a nod. "Thank you." Travis nodded back. "Sometimes," he said softly. "It ain't about fixing what's broken, just about hearing what's still whole." They left the shop, cassette in hand, and for the first time since this whole thing began, Rosie walked not like someone running from something, but like someone walking toward it. The wind had picked up by the time Jim and Rosie stepped back out into the fading afternoon. Long shadows stretched across Main Street, curling around faded storefronts and empty sidewalks like old fingers. Jim adjusted his cap. Rosie tightened her grip on the cassette, thumb brushing the edge like a nervous habit she didn't even realize she'd picked up. Neither of them noticed the vehicle at first, not until the engine growled, low, slow, intentional. A black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, not dusty like every other truck in town. No, this one was polished, clean, city clean, like it didn't belong out here among cracked asphalt and wind-worn fences. The logo on the driver's side door caught the last sliver of sunlight. Cortez Energy. Simple, white letters, professional, cold. Jim's jaw tightened the second he saw it. "Trouble," he muttered. The driver's door swung open. Out stepped a man in a tailored blazer, the kind of fabric that cost more than a month's wages in this town, paired with boots that were too new to have ever touched real dirt. He adjusted his sunglasses even though the sun was almost gone. Scanned the street, then zeroed in on them. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice smooth, polished, practiced, the kind of voice that had closed more deals than most folks ever dreamed of. "Rosalind Harrison, isn't it?" Rosie flinched at the full name. Not many people knew it. Fewer dared say it out loud like they owned the air it traveled on. Jim stepped half a pace forward, not blocking. Not yet. Just present. "Who's asking?" Jim's voice lost none of its usual steady calm, but the edge was there now, tucked just beneath. The man smiled. Thin. No teeth. "Cole Whitaker, Cortez Energy, Regional Development Liaison." He pulled a business card from his jacket like a magician producing a coin. Offered it to Rosie. She didn't take it, didn't move, didn't blink. So Cole let it hover in the air a second longer, then tucked it back into his pocket. "No worries. You probably have your hands full." His gaze flicked, just briefly, to the cassette tape in Rosie's grip, then back to her face. "We've been trying to get in touch," he continued. "A few letters, some emails, even stopped by the land office. Heard you were back in town." Rosie said nothing. Cole adjusted his cuffs, smoothed invisible wrinkles. "We understand it's a lot. Coming back, history, responsibilities, baggage." He smiled again. Practiced. Corporate. "But we also believe in solutions." Jim's shoulders tensed. "Get to the point." Cole's eyes slid toward him, measured, but the smile didn't falter. "Of course. Direct. I like that." He folded his hands in front of him. "Cortez Energy has a standing offer. Generous, fair, for the Harrison property, all of it. Immediate payout. We handle the taxes, the liens, the legal mess. Clean break." His gaze sharpened. "All you'd have to do is sign." Rosie's lips parted. Not to speak, just to breathe. The air felt thinner now, heavy. Jim cut in before she could. "Not interested." Cole's head tilted. "Not your decision, Mr. Carter." "Right." A tiny nod. "Well, Mr. Carter, I'm sure you mean well. But this really is a matter between Miss Harrison and Cortez." He turned back to Rosie. "Clock's ticking. You've probably heard. 30 days until the county steps in. Once that auction's set, all bets are off. Property gets broken up. You walk away with nothing. Silence. The kind that prickles against skin. Rosie didn't move, didn't speak, but something shifted in her posture, subtle, like a fault line under strain. Cole pulled a folded envelope from his jacket, slid it across the hood of Jim's truck. "Updated offer," he said. "More than fair, you won't get better." He stepped back, smiled one last time, a smile shaped like a hook. "We'll be in touch." The SUV door slammed, engine roared, tires kicked up dust, and just like that, Cortez's energy was gone, but the dust lingered, and so did the weight of the choice now sitting between Rosie's hands and her future. The conference room smelled like air freshener, trying too hard to hide something older. Older than the carpet, older than the wallpaper curling at the seams, older maybe than the idea of fairness itself. Rosie sat at the far end of a long table. Jim sat to her left, elbows planted, hands folded, silent, solid, the kind of quiet that wasn't absent, but presence. Across from them, Cole Whitaker didn't bother hiding his smile this time. It was wider, sharper, less polished, more teeth. Beside him sat a lawyer, or someone who wanted to be seen as one. Gray suit, slick hair, a stack of manila folders spread out like a poker hand. His nameplate simply read, R. Daniels, Legal Affairs. Cole leaned forward, laced his fingers. "Rosalind, let's not waste time. You've had a few days to think it over." His tone was silk over steel. "The offer stands. Buyout. Full assumption of the taxes, a payout that, frankly, most folks in your position would be smart enough to take." He pushed a folder across the table. Neat, labeled, prepared. Jim didn't even look at it. Rosie didn't touch it. Cole kept going. "But if, for whatever reason, you feel sentimental, or confused, or let's say poorly advised." His smile thinned. His gaze sharpened. Daniels slid a second folder forward. "We're prepared to move to litigation." Rosie blinked. Her throat tightened. Jim didn't flinch. "On what grounds?" Daniels cleared his throat. Polished. Practiced. Soulless. "Failure to maintain the property. Lapsed taxes. Negligence regarding mineral rights that may impact regional infrastructure." He opened the folder, pulled a document free. "A preliminary motion to petition the county for seizure on the grounds of abandonment and environmental hazard risk." Jim's hands curled into fists. His voice dropped half an octave. "Hazard? It's a ranch." Daniels adjusted his cuffs. "Unmaintained fencing. Collapsing structures, wildlife intrusion, potential for groundwater contamination. Shall I go on?" Cole tapped the table. "Look, nobody wants that. It's messy, public, ugly." His gaze flicked to Rosie. "But it's real. You've got, what, 3 weeks now? Maybe less. Clock's ticking. We can file this tomorrow, or—" He nudged the first folder closer again. "Or you sign, walk away, clean, no court, no debt, no stress, silence, heavy, thick." Rosie stared at the folders like they were snakes, coiled, waiting. Jim leaned forward, slow, deliberate. "Let me get this straight," he said, voice calm in the way only a man who's seen worse storms can be. "You're threatening a lawsuit over fences and bad luck, unless she sells you the land." Daniels didn't blink. "It's not a threat. It's a notice of intent." Cole shrugged. "Standard procedure." Rosie's hands trembled beneath the table. Not from fear. Not exactly. From something else. Something sharper. Something rising in her that surprised even her. "This land," she said quietly, "has been in my family for 4 generations." Cole smiled. "Not for much longer." Jim sat back, crossed his arms. "You know, vultures circle doesn't mean the cow's dead." Daniels offered a polite, sterile smile. "We don't make the rules, Mr. Carter, we just navigate them." Cole folded his hands again. Rosalind, nobody's the villain here. You've got history, sure, but history doesn't pay taxes, doesn't fix broken roofs, doesn't clear mineral claims. His voice softened, almost kind, almost. This is just business. Rosie stared at him, at the man who spoke her name like it was a line on a ledger, at the papers meant to bury her roots under asphalt and dollar signs. She glanced at Jim. His jaw was set, his hands steady, then back at the folders. She didn't open them, didn't touch them, didn't need to. Her voice was quiet, clear. I'll think about it. Cole smiled wider. Of course, take your time. Daniels slid a card across the table. Not too much time. Rosie stood. Jim stood with her. Neither shook hands. Neither looked back. As they stepped into the sunlight outside, Jim let out a long breath. Snake pit, he muttered. Rosie didn't answer. Didn't need to. The choice wasn't clearer. But the fight was. The drive back was quiet, but not the comfortable kind. The kind where words pile up behind clenched teeth, where thoughts rattle louder than the tires on gravel, where neither person knows how to start, or maybe neither one wants to. Jim gripped the wheel tighter than usual. Knuckles pale, eyes fixed ahead, though the road barely needed guiding out here. He'd driven it 100 times. Probably could have done it blindfolded. Rosie sat stiff in the passenger seat, arms crossed, shoulders pulled in, her gaze out the window, but not seeing the fields, not the fences, not the hills bruised purple under the setting sun, just thinking. Or maybe fighting with herself. Jim finally broke the silence. You don't have to fight this. His voice was steady but softer than she expected. Not an order, not advice, just truth. Rosie didn't answer right away. Then, you think I should sell? It wasn't a question, more accusation than anything. Jim sighed. I think... He paused. Hands tightened on the wheel. I think walking away ain't always the same as quitting. Rosie turned sharp. Feels the same. Not always. A long stretch of silence. The truck bumped over a rut. Gravel spit out beneath the tires. Jim kept his eyes forward. I've seen folks pour everything they got into something, and it still breaks. Sometimes knowing when to let go, that's not weakness. Rosie's jaw clenched. It's not just dirt, I know. It's my mother. It's everything she fought for, everything I ran from. Jim nodded, quiet, thoughtful. And now, you gotta figure out if it's something you're running toward or still running from. The words hung there, between them, heavy, true. When they pulled back into the yard, Ella was waiting. She sat cross-legged in the dirt, her little backpack beside her, a tangle of crayons spread around like spilled candy, head bent low over a sheet of paper. So focused, she didn't even look up when the truck rolled in. Jim stepped out first, stretched his back, tried to breathe past the knot between his ribs. Rosie followed, slower, shoulders still tight. Ella looked up then, grinned wide. Dad! Miss Rosie, look! She scrambled to her feet, held the paper up, both hands gripping the edges like it might fly away if she didn't. On it, drawn in crayon, was a gate. Not just any gate, the ranch gate, but fixed, whole, straight, thick posts, fresh boards, bright red letters across the top, Harrison Ranch. No broken hinges, no sagging lines, just standing, proud. Rosie blinked. Knees felt looser than they had all day. Ella beamed. I figured, if the real one's broken, maybe you could use a new one. Jim knelt beside her, smiled, ran a hand through her hair. That's pretty good, kiddo. Ella nodded, serious. It's got a latch, and bolts, and And I made the wood stronger so it doesn't fall next time. Her finger traced the beams. See, this part here, it's extra. Jim chuckled. Reinforced, huh? Yeah. Rosie crouched down, reached out. Her fingertips brushed the paper. Light, gentle, like touching something fragile, or maybe something sacred. For a long moment, she just stared. Then her voice, smaller than usual, slipped out. It's beautiful. Ella grinned. You can use it if you want. Rosie blinked hard, swallowed. Yeah, I think I do. Jim watched her. Watched the way her shoulders softened, just a little. Watched the way her hands stopped trembling. Ella wasn't done. I drew it strong, 'cause when something's broke, you can always fix it. She said it simple, matter of fact. Like the sky is blue, like the dirt is brown, like broken things don't stay broken, if you decide they won't. Jim stood, ruffled Ella's hair. Smart kid, Ella shrugged. Miss Rosie's gonna fix it. Rosie didn't answer, didn't need to. Her hands closed around the drawing, folded it carefully, slipped it into her jacket pocket, not because it was a blueprint for a gate, but because maybe it was a blueprint for something bigger, for a way forward, for a way home. The morning came colder than expected. Thin frost stretched across the tall grass like someone had pulled a veil over the land overnight. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and cedar, sharper now, like the land itself was holding its breath. Jim waited by the truck, arms folded, leaning against the tailgate. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He just watched as Rosie walked the fence line, slow, steady, one boot in front of the other, tracing the boundary not with her hands, but with her eyes. The same boundary her mother once walked, the same one she'd once sworn never to cross again. The paper Ella gave her was tucked in her back pocket, folded neat, worn soft from being opened, studied, then folded again. She stopped at the old gatepost, the one leaning sideways, half sunk in mud, the bolts rusted so thin they were barely holding. Her fingers brushed over the splintered wood, traced the cracks. She didn't feel the cold, didn't notice the wind. All she heard was the echo of a voice on an old cassette, and the sound of her own heartbeat answering it. Her mother's words were still clear. The land waits, and so do I. Jim watched her breathe, watched her shoulders lift then settle. When Rosie turned back toward him, something was different, subtle, but real. Her spine was straighter, her steps sure. She walked to the truck, stopped just shy of it, met Jim's eyes, steady, quiet, but full of something she hadn't carried in years. Resolve. I'm not selling, she said. Simple, clear. Not loud, didn't need to be. Jim didn't smile right away, didn't nod, just studied her face like checking whether this was solid or just something said to fill the air. But it was solid, rock solid. Yeah, Jim finally said. I figured. Rosie pulled the folded envelope, the offer from Cortez, from her jacket, held it between her fingers for a second. Then she walked over to the old burn barrel near the barn, lifted the lid, struck a match. Paper caught fast in the cold air, edges curled, ink darkened, bubbled, then vanished. She didn't watch it burn, didn't have to. Jim stepped beside her, hands in his jacket pockets, quiet. You sure? He asked. Not because he doubted her, just because asking was part of the ritual of decisions like this. Rosie nodded. I'm sure. A long pause. Then she whispered it. Not to him, not to the wind, not even to the land, to herself. I choose to stay. The words tasted strange in her mouth, new, scary, but right. Jim let out a breath, long, deep, like something he didn't know he'd been holding finally let go. All right then, he said. Let's figure out how to fight. Rosie looked out at the hills, the crooked fence lines, the barn held together with rope and stubbornness, the roof that sighed when the wind pressed against it. It was broken, falling apart, wounded, but so was she. And maybe, just maybe, that meant they were exactly right for each other. The morning air was sharp, crisp enough to sting the lungs, but bright, clean, like something had been scrubbed out of the sky overnight. Jim rolled the post-hole digger off the truck bed. The steel clanged against the dirt as it hit the ground. Rosie stood next to him, arms crossed, studying the old gate line. Ella bounced at her side, a hammer too big for her hands gripped with all the determination in the world. The old posts lay in a heap now, splintered, rotten. The last storm had done what time hadn't yet finished. Rosie knelt, fingers running through the dirt where the gate once stood. This was the first thing folks saw when they pulled up, she murmured. Jim nodded. Yeah, first impression matters. Ella plopped down next to them, pulling her drawing from her jacket pocket. Edges wrinkled, corners softened from being folded and unfolded over and over. I made the new one stronger, she declared. See, double bolts here, and the top beam's thicker. Won't fall this time. Rosie smiled, but it was the kind of smile wrapped in something deeper, a mixture of gratitude, and grief, and something bigger than either. Yeah, she whispered, won't fall this time. Jim shoved the post-hole digger into the dirt, muscles straining, the tool bit deep, cutting past roots and stubborn clay. Ella scrambled to gather bolts from the toolbox, laying them out in rows like treasures. For a while, nobody spoke. There was only the rhythm of labor, metal biting earth, wood creaking under weight, the occasional grunt when something didn't fit quite right. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of choice, of a kind of rebuilding that wasn't just about fence posts and hinges, but about something quieter, something harder, something worth the splinters. Jim measured, checked, measured again. Rosie held the post steady as he set it into place. The beam was heavier than she remembered, or maybe it was just that she'd never helped set one before. Ella stood nearby, tiny hands on her hips, supervising like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's not straight, she pointed out. Jim glanced. It's leaning with character. Ella frowned. No, needs to be straight. Jim chuckled. Bossy. Precise, she corrected. Rosie grinned despite herself. She's right. Jim sighed, adjusted the post. All right, all right. Together they set the crossbeam. Heavy, solid pine, sanded smooth, fresh bolts gleaming like small promises. The sign came next. Ella carried it with both hands, moving like someone transporting fragile glass instead of painted wood. It wasn't the old sign. That one had fallen, splintered, lost to time. This one was new, cut by Rosie's hands the night before, letters carved slow, careful, each stroke measured, painted a deep, steady red. Harrison Ranch. No frills, no curls, just the name and a line beneath it, smaller but clear. This land remembers. Jim held the ladder while Rosie climbed. Her hands trembled, not from fear of heights, but because of what this meant, what it finally meant. She lined up the bolts, slid them through, tightened them slow, steady. When the last one clicked into place, she leaned back just a little, looked at it. The wind tugged at her hair. The sun caught the fresh paint, made it glow. For a long moment, none of them said a word. Then Ella whispered, soft but certain, "It looks like it's supposed to." Jim nodded. "Yeah, it does." Rosie stepped down, looked at both of them. Her family. Not the one she was born with, the one she built, the one that chose her, and that she finally chose back. Jim brushed his hands against his jeans. One more thing. He walked to the truck, pulled something from the glove box. The feather, the silver pendant, the one Rosie left behind once, years ago, when she walked away from this place, from herself. He handed it to her. Rosie turned it over in her palm. The metal was worn smooth now, familiar. She walked to the center post, tied it to a nail right under the sign. Let it hang there, catching the sunlight, turning slowly in the wind. Let it remind us, she said quietly, that broken things can be made whole. Jim tipped his hat. Ella reached for Rosie's hand. Together, the three of them stood there, not in front of a gate, but in front of a beginning. The sun hung low now, one of those late afternoon sunsets that didn't rush, didn't blaze, just unfolded. Soft, gentle, like the sky itself was exhaling after a long day. Shadows stretched across the field, long golden fingers reaching over fence posts and tall grass. The wind had calmed. Only the rustle of cottonwoods remained, a sound that didn't demand attention, just existed, steady, familiar. Rosie sat on the front porch steps, boots off, bare feet resting on the warm, splintered wood. Her old pair of cowboy boots sat beside the door, scuffed, weathered, one heel worn more than the other. The kind of boots that told a story just by being there. Not cleaned, not polished, just honest. Inside, the kettle whistled soft on the stove. Ella's laughter drifted out through the screen door, tangled up with the low hum of Jim's voice reading aloud from a worn paperback. Something about horses, or heroes, or both. Rosie leaned back against the post, closed her eyes. Let the sound of home, real home, fill the spaces where fear used to live. Out here, things didn't move fast. Fences broke, gates sagged, roofs leaked, but the land stayed. It waited, it forgave, and somehow, so did she. Her fingers brushed the silver feather still hanging by the porch, the same one from the gate, the same one Jim had kept safe longer than she ever realized. It spun gently in the breeze, caught the last threads of sunlight, reflected it back not like a mirror, but like something softer, quieter, a promise whispered instead of shouted. She opened her eyes, looked out. The orchard was still just bare sticks in dirt, rows of saplings, fragile, thin, but there, rooted now, their first leaves trembling in the wind. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something, and something was more than nothing. A soft creak. The screen door opened. Jim stepped out, mug in hand, steam curling into the air. "Figured you might need this," he said. Rosie smiled, took it, fingers wrapped around the ceramic, warm, solid. "Thanks." Jim sat beside her. Didn't say much. Didn't need to. They watched the sun dip lower. Let the silence do what it was best at. Holding things words couldn't quite carry. Ella burst through the door next, skidded to a stop. Dropped into Rosie's lap like she'd done it 1,000 times, even though this was still new. "Look," she said, holding up a folded piece of paper. Crayon lines, more sketches, this time. The barn, fresh paint, a horse paddock, a garden, solar panels drawn crooked on the roof. Rosie ran her fingers over the page. "Looks ambitious." Ella grinned. "Dream big, right?" Jim chuckled. "That's what they say." For a while, they just sat like that. 3 people, a porch, a fading sun, nothing fancy, no declarations, no grand finales, just living. Just choosing. The wind shifted, brought the smell of earth, of cedar, of rain waiting somewhere just over the ridge. Rosie sipped her coffee, let it settle. Her eyes drifted back to her boots, still sitting there, still worn, still hers, a life she once walked away from, now waiting right where she left it, and this time she was ready to step back in. The sun finally slipped beneath the hill. The sky softened to deep blue. Stars began poking through one by one, like someone lighting candles in the dark. The porch light clicked on, soft, steady, a glow that didn't try to chase away the night, just made sure anyone passing by knew. This house wasn't empty, not anymore. The porch light stayed on, not because anyone was scared of the dark, but because someone finally was home. Somewhere out by the orchard, the youngest tree stood, barely taller than Ella, its thin branches shaking softly in the evening wind, weak but rooted. A reminder that sometimes the smallest things still grow, if someone cares enough to stay. The silver feather hanging from the gate swayed, catching the last glow of sunset, and maybe catching something else too, the quiet promise of tomorrow. If this story left something with you, even just a little warmth, maybe leave a like or share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And if you're the kind of person who knows that sometimes the simple act of staying is the bravest story of all, then maybe hit subscribe. There's always another story waiting, and you're always welcome here.